Good day. I'm Larry Johnson. This is Counter Currents. You can also find me at sonar21.com. And I am pleased to have an old friend, Dimitri K, today to swim against the currents. Dimitri is back in the news. I think you're the only one in the world who has been both a dissident of the Soviet Union and fled communism, and now have had to flee the new authoritarianism that's taken over in the United States. So at least you're a man true to your principles, and I appreciate you being here. So let's dive into it. Give us your background as far as what led to you leaving the Soviet Union and going to the United States. It was 1972.
I left on January 2nd, 1973, but I got my visa in December 1972. I just got out of the infamous Matroskaya Tishina prison. Matroskaya Tishina, I guess, translates as a quiet sailor. Spent there a couple of interesting weeks, lost a lot of weight, but otherwise it was civilized. And I was accused of petty hooliganism, which actually consisted of taking part in a hunger strike organized at the Russian Telegraph by Soviet refuseniks. The only problem was that I was arrested on my way from the restaurant. So I was not quite a part of hunger strike. But because I knew these people and kind of sympathized with them and stopped by to see whether they were okay, I guess that was sufficient to consider me one of them. I applied for a visa several months before that. They did not take my visa application because they were not taking visa applications for the United States, only for Israel, Germany, and Canada. And so I sent my application to the Supreme Soviet, where I said that I want to leave the Soviet Union because of what I said at the time, fundamental disagreement with the Soviet system. And my agreement was rather fundamental. It was the end of the Brezhnev era. And basically, for a person in my profession, I was a student of international relations. It simply was impossible to practice my profession with a minimal degree of integrity.
You'd already graduated from the university there in Moscow?
I graduated from the university, and I also graduated from the what they called aspirantura. I guess it is like it is above advanced studies in the United States. It leads you toward a doctorate. But because I decided to leave, I presented my dissertation for review by the Academic Council of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations. It was approved, but because I decided to leave, it never was sent to the Ministry of Higher Education for confirmation. So technically, I did not get my doctorate, but I did finish the graduate school.
So what's that like? Leaving your country, your homeland, and then showing up in the United States, because with 73, I was just graduating high school, and we were still embroiled in Vietnam. Nixon was in the midst of Watergate, and you didn't have a social safety net here waiting for you. How did you navigate the waters back then?
I did not have any social safety net. Some people in Moscow who had American connections recommended me to the Russian Institute at Columbia. And I went there, they talked to me, and they were very nice. and said, well, you know, we're very small. We have nothing for you. Later, director of this institute, Marshall Schulman, became a good friend, but at that time, he had nothing to offer. And then I went to Washington and went to an association meeting as Association of Slavic Studies. And I began meeting people. And I don't know how to say it. In Washington, it was easy to meet people at that time. And it did not take many months for me to get to know Dr. David Epshire, who was at that time the president of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he talked to the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Fred de Klerk,
Yeah.
who later became Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Studies. Fred de Klerk gave a grant to the Center for Strategic and International Studies for me to study Soviet decision-making on arms control and disarmament. And that's how I got my first job.
You know, and I'm going back a little bit through the history because I think anybody who's under the age of 50 now doesn't remember this period. I mean, because, well, heavens, even if they're maybe 60 years old, they barely have memories of it because back then, the Soviets and the United States had been in a proxy war in Vietnam. And, you know, I think the conventional wisdom was that the Chinese were more involved, but the reality was the Soviets were more involved in helping the North Vietnamese and effectively helped the North Vietnamese defeat the United States. And in spite of all of that, and the Cold War was at its height, yet there were still conversations going on between between the Soviets and the United States. It was, and just you're a living example of, yeah, we were at odds, but the visa section was open and you were able to secure a visa and get to come to the United States. You can compare and contrast that period with what we're going through right now.
Larry, a person whom I met at that time in Washington and who proved to be very helpful to me and later became a very good friend was a person from whom you would not necessarily expect a kind of this helping hand to somebody who recently left the Soviet Union. His name was Paul Nitze.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
At that time, he was an assistant secretary of defense.
Right.
And Fred de Klerk talked to him and told him that I perhaps could tell some interesting things about Soviet approach to arms control. So I went to see Paul Nitze. And Paul was very interested in having an informal dialogue with the Soviet Union, since you mentioned dialogue.
Yeah.
Paul, those who do not know, used to be a hardliner and actually became a hardliner several years later when he was a founding father of the Committee on the Present Danger. But when he was on the job at Pentagon, he wanted to have dialogue. And the fact that I was telling him that no, I did not like the Soviet system, but I did not think that the Soviet Union was about to attack the United States, and that the Brezhnev regime was genuinely interested in some kind of rapprochement. For Paul, it was not an indication that I was a kind of a dangerous pacifist, but on the contrary, was an indication that I could be helpful to American understanding of how to deal with the Soviet Union. It was a totally different mindset than today, because I think that if I was telling somebody today what I was telling Paul Nitze at the time, they would say, "You are repeating what Putin is saying." And there is no need to have a serious conversation anymore.
Yeah, that's what really frightens me is the just the complete dismissal of anything that the Russians now say or do as just being completely irrelevant. That there is nothing to talk about. That we have no common grounds, and yet, in my brief visits there, what I've seen is a reawakened society. I mean, it was always there, but I saw it as open. I saw it as a level of freedom. The normal American image is that you're being chased by secret police. I barely saw police on the streets, both in Moscow and St. Peter. I mean, is the damnedest thing. You go to New York City, you're going to see a cop every 2 blocks.
Larry, I couldn't travel to the Soviet Union during the Cold War because I was persona non grata. But I began coming back to the Soviet Union, visited many times, I would say, starting in 1987, when I came to Moscow as a part of Secretary George Shul's journalistic entourage.
Mm-hmm.
During all this time, I had one conversation with the KGB, never with FSB, only with the KGB. And that was in 1991, when I was accompanying former President Richard Nixon when he went to see Chairman Khrushchev. And at that time, obviously, I met the chairman, and they were nice enough to send somebody. Later, I discovered it was actually a major general. Somebody came to see me at the hotel and said, "Well, you're such a great fellow. We like to know more of what you think. And if you share your thoughts with us, we can show them with the leadership." I was very appreciative, as you can imagine, immediately shared it with Nixon. Then I have shared it with the American ambassador, who at that time was Jack Matlock.
Yeah.
And then I have shared it with the Washington Post. But otherwise, I never was approached to have any contact with Russian security services. I think that if a Russian would be coming to the United States, and it would be a person with some interesting connections in Moscow, particularly in the national security field, I think it is almost inevitable that the FBI would want to talk to him.
Right.
But that was not my experience in Russia, and that was not an experience of many Americans whom I know in Moscow.
Yeah. I mean, I've got some experience doing counter surveillance, and did a training seminar for some Eastern European journalists back in 2016. There was no security presence. I was completely unencumbered, and they weren't. Again, the old mythology about what the Soviet Union was, or at least perceived to be, in terms of what Russia is today. And yet, the West were treating Russia as if it's the reincarnation of Hitler's Nazi Germany or something. I mean, it's bizarre. What do you have any explanation for this irrational hatred of Russia?
Well, let me say first, I want to be precise. When I talked of having no interaction with the KGB, I meant since I left the Soviet Union.
When
I lived in the Soviet Union, I never had any involvement with the KGB. But clearly, I should say they were all over the place. And at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, there was a special department which kind of monitored any contacts between staff members of the Institute and any foreigners, particularly Americans. So there are no questions that the Soviet Union was a closed society where contacts with foreigners were considered a privilege. And if somebody wanted to have these contacts without being delegated to have these contacts, or at a minimum having an approval, these people could get into any kind of trouble. Nothing like that certainly exists today. And it is impossible to have something like that today because plenty of Russians, including of important Russians, have relatives in the United States, have children in the United States, and it is not used against them. I see absolutely no evidence where WEC Channel 1, we have several staff members who have American citizenship, and we have a number of people who have their children or other close relatives living in the United States. I don't see anyone from security services even bothering to talk to them. So I think that you're asking a very good question. Why such unreasonable, excessive hatred of Russia, which is not based on Russian behavior?
Correct.
I do think that somebody very influential really wants this to be going on in the United States. If you look at the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian leadership was going out of its way to be friendly with the United States.
Right.
And they were indeed prepared to be a junior partner. And I think that President George Bush Sr., his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, they did not want to treat the Soviet Union as a superpower because the Soviet Union stopped being a superpower.
Right.
But they certainly thought that they could have normal relationship with this new Russia. And you know, I'm sure better than me, that there was even a sentiment to that effect at the CIA, where the chief of Soviet division, Mil Birden, he wrote a book where he was describing very graphically how he was one of the ultimate knights of the Cold War, but he came to a conclusion that the Cold War was over, and he wanted to have a more cooperative relationship, not only with New Russia, but even more specifically with Russian security services. A man for whom I worked for many years, who was chairman of the board of the Center for the National Interest, where I was president, General Chuck Boyd. He was deputy commander-in-chief of NATO forces in Europe. He wanted to bring Russia into NATO. And you know as well as I do that there were plenty of examples. Mm-hmm. But somehow, forces who needed to demonize Russia, they have proven much stronger. And it is a tragedy, in my view, that what was done in the 90s, they put the need to maintain NATO above fundamental interests of American foreign policy. I always thought that alliances, they're supposed to be a foreign policy instrument, not an end in themselves. So because it was felt by the deep state in America that it was essential to keep NATO going and actually to keep NATO expanding, it was natural that people like that, with beliefs like that, would need an enemy.
Right.
And they were doing everything possible to turn Russia into an enemy. And at first, Russia was ignoring it. And actually, when Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, who was called Mr. Yes, while he was still on the job, when he was told that Russia was not entirely complying with American requests, he was trying to do better. He now lives in the United States and criticizes Russia on many occasions. But then gradually, obviously, there was a counterbalancing action in Russia. And even during the Yeltsin rule, the United States was becoming less and less popular in Russia. And Russia began doing things. They did not have resources to do many things against American interests. But gradually, of course, as George Kennan have predicted, the way Russia was mistreated had consequences. And Russia became more nationalist. more suspicious of the United States, and less prepared to accommodate American interests.
Hey, I look at it, and correct. I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong or off base, but it's as if Russia awakened from a sleep. It had been in this dream state for many years, where it really saw itself as secondary or inferior to the United States, or felt that it needed to have this relationship with the United States. And then over the course of these last 2.5 years, Russia has awakened to the fact that, hey, we can stand on our own. We don't need the United States. And we have values of our own that are actually superior to those in the West. And the irony is Russia has now become, in one sense, sort of that city on the hill that Ronald Reagan talked about with respect to the United States. It has become a beacon of morality and traditional values. Am I simplifying this too much?
No, I think you're exactly right. And in a way, it is good for Russia. But in a way, obviously, it also creates resentment because there was, I wouldn't even say that there was a great admiration for the United States in the 90s. There was affection, there was love.
Yeah.
There was a sense that now Russia got rid of communism. Very few people thought that Russia was defeated in the Cold War. The sense was that Russia made its own decisions. And now Russia would be joining the United States as a friend, as a country with similar values, which was willing to learn a lot from the United States. And when it was all contemptuously dismissed, then, of course, you would see a lot of people coming to a conclusion, and Putin actually talked about this many times, that Russia was naive, that Russia was too trusting, that Russia made too many concessions.
Yeah.
And they began to look at themselves and saying, well, why should we be inferior? We have our civilization, we have our values. And now they're saying Russia is one country against an alliance of 50, coalition of 50, led by the United States in a crusade against Russia. And Russia is not exactly winning, but Russia certainly is not losing. And without mobilization, with a kind of normal life, not everywhere, certainly not in Kursk or in Belgrade, but most Russia enjoys a pretty normal life. And if you would be now in Moscow, it would not occur to you that this is a country which is engaged in a brutal war.
Right.
The shops are full. I was yesterday in the new huge restaurant. There was not a single vacant table.
Yeah. Well, no, it is something fundamental, I think, has changed in the course of the last 2.5 years. I think history will go back and mark this as a significant moment of transformation in the world order that'll be comparable to the post-World War II period, with the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, these other, I'll call them Western-controlled institutions that have been sort of the foundation for the existing international rules-based order. I think that's in collapse. And Russia, along with China now, they're really forging something new. And I guarantee you, most people in the West don't appreciate that, or they dismiss it as silly, nonsensical.
Larry, I remember vividly how several years ago, when I was still in Washington and still running the Center for the National Interest, we had a call from the Chinese embassy. And they said that Chinese deputy foreign minister was in Washington and was interested in visiting me. And we had a good meeting with him. He probably remember my deputy at the time, Paul Saunders,
Yeah.
who is now running the center. So we had a meeting with this guy. And I was surprised to discover that his principal message was, you should not trust Russia.
Yeah.
That Russia, they need to keep a kind of a civilized relationship with Russia, but Russia expects too much. Russia cannot deliver what China really needs. Russia has revisionist ambitions. Today, these ambitions create problems for the United States, but soon they would create problems for China as well. And I tried to find out later to what extent this gentleman represented mainstream thinking in China. And I was told that there was a debate in China, including a debate in the Chinese government of how to build relations with both Russia and the United States. And that they wanted to make an effort to have a friendly relationship with the United States. And at that time, they probably were willing, at least some of them were willing, to sacrifice any special relationship with Russia. What did the geniuses in the Obama administration and then particularly in subsequent administrations have done? They have done what Kissinger considered impossible.
Yeah.
A real closeness between Moscow and Beijing. And you know that Kissinger and Nixon, they were saying that it should be a major objective of American foreign policy to have better relations with China and Russia than they had with each other.
Yeah.
And of course, now China and Russia, they have some mutual interests, real mutual interests, quite independent from the rivalry with the United States. But I think that the United States, the US government, became a major catalyst of Russian-Chinese rapprochement. And when Biden is bragging about his policy successes, like reuniting the West, he is not mentioning that he also led to a gradual appearance of an anti-American alliance. And principal architects of this alliance, which includes China, which includes Russia, which increasingly includes Iran, North Korea, the principal architects of this alliance are not in Moscow, not in Beijing. They're in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. In fact, I think you're making a good case that Joe Biden deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for this reason. He's brought Russia and China together, and he's brought the Sunni and Shia Muslims together.
Against the United States. Against the United States.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable. You know, I first met
Larry,
you.
sorry to interrupt you. Who could believe that the United States would facilitate friendship between Russia and Afghanistan?
Yeah. No, it's like we've walked through the Alice in Wonderland's looking glass, and we're in some alternate, bizarre universe. I want to go back and touch briefly on the Center for National Interest, because that's where I first met you. I got the invite to attend. You had a session, I think it was December of 2002, and the Jim Schlesinger, former director of the CIA, was there. Ambassador Joe Wilson, the husband of my former CIA classmate, Valerie Plame. I didn't know that at the time. Pat Lang, former chief of the Middle East Division, Charles Krautheimer. There were about 15 of us there, and you were having the discussion about, will there be a war in Iraq? So your position at the Center for National Interest really puts you in the heart of the U.S. foreign policy establishment there in Washington, D.C. I mean, you were always hosting a variety of events and bringing people together, key policymakers, and you were also, I guess, when did you get your American citizenship?
A long ago, in 1980.
Okay, so, but again, here you are as an American citizen. not as some Soviet spy, and respect it. You can still go on the internet today and find a variety of these sessions from the Center for National Interest. How did you get introduced to Richard Nixon? Because you had some relationship with him, and I know his family, because I remember I did attend one event where David Eisenhower and Julie Nixon Eisenhower were there.
I was writing in the 1980s a column for the Christian Science Monitor, which at that time was a rather, I shouldn't say influential, prestigious newspaper.
Yeah.
I wrote a column on the occasion of 10th anniversary of Nixon's resignation. And I said there that he made some very serious mistakes, but at the same time, he was a patriot. He was a deep foreign policy thinker, and that he had great accomplishments like getting out of Vietnam, like rapprochement with China, and of course, detente with Russia. And I got a very nice note from President Nixon. He was particularly, I think, amused that at that time I was working at the Carnegie Endowment, which, as you may remember, was exactly not his favorite institution.
Right.
Whom he succeeded in exposing as a Soviet spy. He used to be in charge of the Carnegie Endowment. So Nixon wrote to me that he was not sure that my Carnegie colleagues would quite like that. But he, of course, was grateful. And I obviously sent him a nice note, and then he wrote me a couple of times suggesting, believe it or not, what I should say in my articles. I reciprocated by telling him what I suggested he could say in his articles. And then he invited me to come to his office. He had an office in New York and Lower Manhattan. And I should say it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
That's remarkable. There's I've just seen there's a podcast out or a video interview on the internet where someone goes in depth into what really happened at Watergate and how Nixon was betrayed by by John Dean in particular, and set up, and that even some of the most egregious accusations against Nixon really are without foundation. But he did manage to, in a way, to go from the humiliation of being forced from office and still have been influential in the foreign policy front.
Well, Nixon was a remarkable man. He was a flawed man. Who is not flawed? I certainly am. But he was a man. I think that he was a real strategic thinker. Mm-hmm. Perhaps, as Kissinger would sometimes acknowledge, in terms of rapprochement with China, simultaneously with Russia, he felt that Nixon was a real strategic thinker and gave Kissinger an opportunity to implement it, to make it happen. I also think that he was betrayed by John Dean. Of course, he was so effective because obviously Nixon was not involved in Watergate himself.
Right.
I am convinced, and there was never evidence of that.
Correct.
But he clearly was involved in the cover-up. There is no question about that. And you can say that he did it out of excessive loyalty to some of his associates. Or you can say that he did it because he thought that the president is always right. He certainly felt that Lyndon Johnson was doing same things and got away with them. But I now have my theory, which is no more than my personal theory of what happened to Nixon. Mark Felt happened to Nixon.
Yeah.
And Mark Felt, for those who do not know, he was a deputy director of the FBI. But he was deputy director of the FBI, who also developed a unique relationship with a very liberal Washington Post. And Felt, of course, because of his job, he knew about a lot of things that were happening in the administration, in the White House, and he was very selectively leaking them
Right.
to the Washington Post. I did not know Mr. Felt at that time, but I had an opportunity to meet him later. And he was explaining to me what a great man was Angleton, James Jesus Angleton.
Oh, my God.
You may remember he was chief
yes.
of CIA counterintelligence, and a lot of people felt that he did more damage to the CIA than the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Because Angleton was a total anti-communist paranoiac, and he felt that if there was a Soviet defector or a Soviet approaching the CIA with an offer, that probably it was a provocation. And the CIA case officer who would be willing to work with these people, they knew that they would become suspects.
Yeah.
And I was shocked that many years after Angleton really was exposed, fired, Felt was still telling me what a great man Angleton was. The reason I'm telling that is because I do feel that Felt perhaps was resentful vis-a-vis Nixon because he himself wanted to be appointed CIA director after Hoover's death.
Yeah.
I think that he probably did not like that Nixon created a special security unit in the White House, not to rely on the FBI. But I think that Mark Felt was a person who was the ultimate representative of deep state. And he really was very angry with Nixon because of his detente with the Soviet Union.
Right.
Now, that is not my intuition. That's what he told me himself.
Right. No, I think you're right. In fact, Felt's, this was a conversation actually that Tucker Carlson had, I think, just last week, now that I'm recalling the podcast, with a fellow who was in the Nixon administration at the time and has written 3 books and done extensive research. And he pointed out that Felt was angry that Nixon didn't name him as FBI director and selected Pat Gray. And that then when you look at the record of Woodward and his writings about Deep Throat, always intimating that this was coming out of the Nixon White House, when in fact it wasn't. It was coming out of the FBI. So they were, deliberately misleading in that regard. Now, Nixon's not the only president that you've had involvement with and done some work for, because now you're, quote, in trouble again because of your relationship with Donald Trump. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think people need to understand what's being, in my view, what's being done to you is so outrageous, so unfair, and so reminiscent of the old Soviet Union that you've got to feel like it's deja vu all over again.
Well, Larry, let me start with what was done to me. I actually feel very angry with the search which they recently had in my house in Huntley, Virginia, because it really was not a search. It was a pogrom. It was reminiscent of what the Nazis were doing to Jews during the Crystal Night. Mm-hmm. The house was 50 people came there. 50 people. They took literally anything of value. They took from the walls paintings, which I got from my parents, which these paintings were given to my parents by prominent Russian avant-garde artists, because my parents were human rights lawyers and were not taking any financial payment from the dissidents. They took the icons. They took furniture. They, it really was a pogrom. They broke the roof. They took valuable things like 2 hammocks, which Anastasia, my wife, bought at a local store for some convenience. It was pretty outrageous. And one thing they have left, however, intact. They put on my nightstand a pistol. I had a 6-hour.
Oh, okay.
You know what?
Yeah.
So they took the magazine out, but they put it there. They took about everything that could be even mildly of interest to law enforcement. And they took a lot of things which could not be of a conceivable interest. But they left a pistol. And I do not want to read their mind because my mind doesn't work like that. But it's pretty outrageous. And I saw pictures of what they have done to my walls. We had a marble floor in our foyer, and it was very severely damaged, not a kind of broken away like they were digging and trying to find something. But it really was damaged. And they left a warrant. Which mentioned that the warrant was done on an emergency basis, and they were entitled to enter the house at any time. And there was the address. There was no my name on the warrant. And they did not leave attachments, which are very important in this case, because these attachments explain what all this is about. And no explanation was given. Why did they decide to proceed with the search? And I really think they have frozen my accounts, which make very difficult to pay my mortgage, perhaps impossible with obvious consequences. Obviously, I cannot pay my taxes. So about this, I'm not just very resentful. I'm concerned that something like that can happen in the United States.
Yeah.
Otherwise, nobody forced me to leave the United States. Absolutely not. I was 75. I told my board 2 years before that once I'm 75, I would want to retire. And that's exactly what I did. And I was already working part-time on Channel 1 of Russian TV. I did not intend to leave this job because I really enjoyed it. And I thought it was an important opportunity. And as you may know, I was interviewing a lot of important Americans.
Yeah.
And we were never censoring them. We were never trying to block their criticism of Russia, or even for that matter, their personal criticism of Putin. It became impossible and inappropriate when the war started. You don't do things like that during the war.
Yeah.
But before that, I felt that there was really a very free-flowing discussion on Russian TV. I wanted to do it. You are right. I was investigated by the special counsel in 2018. It was not, as I would put it, this investigation, my favorite entertainment.
Right.
But they did not accuse me of anything illegal or even of anything questionable. And they did not just say that they did not find any evidence of wrongdoing, but they very specifically addressed a number of my activities, like, for instance, facilitating dialogue with Russia.
Yeah.
And they said that they were appropriate. It was a part of my job. It was expected by major foundations that which were supporting the center.
Right.
But I did feel very strongly that what the United States have done in launching a crusade against Russia, that I most certainly could not agree with. And I could not agree with this as an American. I lived in the United States by that time for 50 years. I could not agree with putting the United States on the war footing and risking American security, in my view, without any good reason. And of course, as a person who clearly had roots in Russia and sympathy for Russia, I thought it was unfair to Russia. Regarding Trump, I did not know Mr. Trump. He did not know anything about me. I was at a fundraising meeting in New York in 2016 for our center. It was a very small meeting. Kissinger, our honorary chairman, spoke. And obviously, as you would expect at a fundraising meeting, he said nice things about the center and said nice things about me personally. And there was a person closely associated with Trump. And this person came up to me and said that I think that we should know each other. And then they came to me and said, would you want to host Trump's first foreign policy speech? And to be realistic, one reason they went to me is because the Council on Foreign Relations probably would not be quite ready. At that time, when it became clear that Trump would be the Republican nominee, that all changed, and there were a lot of organizations that would be prepared to be nice to him. But at that time, there were very few takers. And then they have asked me to help them to put a small advisory group, which I did. It was a very high-level group, very high level. It included 4-star generals, former cabinet members, and interestingly enough, it was bipartisan. And the idea was that it was not a formal group. They were not endorsing Trump. They were not expecting that they would get prestige of being identified as formal members of the campaign, but they were willing to be of help. Unfortunately, Senator Sessions have chaired the group. He later became the Attorney General. And I was helping to coordinate it, and we had very good discussions, and we really liked talking to each other. And it became very clear that the candidate had very little interest in having a serious dialogue with us. So it was an interesting exercise, but I don't think that we had much real influence.
Yeah. Well, I promised to get you out of here after 45 minutes, and we're coming up on that. But just a final question, but this it will also be for future discussion. It looks like we've crossed a red line now in Russian-U.S. relations with respect to the war in Ukraine. That the invasion of Kursk has really shifted Russia's attitude, and the remarks that have been made by both Foreign Minister Lavrov and Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov have been very, very stern and uncharacteristic. I mean, it's not their normal diplomatic language, but basically warning that the United States could actually be paying a price and is playing with fire. What do you make of this?
I would take it quite seriously. I think that Russia was quite decisive in protecting its interests. Obviously, Russian military operation against Ukraine in 2022, Russian support of Donbass in 2014, what Russia have done against Georgia when President Saakashvili have attacked Russian peacekeepers. It was back in 2008. Seems to me that there is a lot of evidence that Russia is prepared to be pretty tough and to use military force. I did not mention Syria, where they projected force and quite successfully. But as you probably know better than me, a consensus gradually began to emerge in Washington and other NATO capitals that there are no real red lines, that Putin was talking tough, but would swallow almost anything because he would not dare to challenge the United States and NATO. And I think it's a big mistake.
Yes.
Because obviously Putin does not want to challenge NATO. And he said it very publicly. In one, I think it was when he was with Sergei Karaganov at the last St. Petersburg Forum.
Right.
He said, so what do you want? When Karaganov was saying that Russia perhaps has to get tougher. So what do you want us to do? To go to war with NATO? Russia does not want to go to war with NATO. Russia does not want a military conflict with the United States. It doesn't mean, however, that they would swallow anything. And what was a kind of, I shouldn't say a shock, but a very unpleasant surprise for the Russian government, how all these weapons provided by the United States and NATO, some of them long distance, many of them very effective against Russian targets, particularly against bridges. And Russians were told that the United States would allow the use of these weapons only inside Ukraine. And they informally were giving assurances that while Crimea officially was considered, officially I mean in the United States, a part of the Ukraine, but nonetheless, even against Crimea, these weapons would not be used. And then, of course, they were used against Donbass, they were used against Crimea, and now they were used against Russian territory, which nobody was questioning of being Russia. Kursk is obviously a place where in August 1943, there was this great battle for Kursk.
Right.
The Germans were attacking and the Russians were able to defeat them. And so for the first time since World War II, German tanks were attacking Kursk, were attacking a Russian city. And the United States became a part of that. And obviously that creates a very strong feeling in Moscow that they are not really fighting with Ukraine. They are fighting with the United States and NATO.
Yeah.
Once they come to this conclusion, the question only is how they should respond. They are not prepared to surrender. They don't feel first that the situation at the front in any way requires surrender. But secondly, they don't trust the Biden administration. They don't think that if they made major concessions, that the United States would stop at that. There is a feeling in Moscow that if Russia would display flexibility, it would be portrayed as a weakness, and that would lead to more pressure, more demands, and they would want to do to Russia today what was done to Yugoslavia in 1999.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
There is absolutely no willingness to accept something like that. So Mr. Biden, I think, is playing with nuclear fire. He confuses two different things. Russian understanding that once you start nuclear, even with tactical nuclear weapons, you never know where you're going to end. There is, I think, a healthy respect for Moscow for NATO military capabilities. They don't understand that attacking NATO targets outside Ukraine, that this would be major escalation. And I think it should be to Putin's credit that he approaches things like that with great, great care. And I would not hesitate to say with reluctance.
Yes, no, I agree.
Unless it becomes absolutely necessary. But if it becomes absolutely necessary, these things, in my view, definitely would be done. I cannot tell you exactly what would be done, not because I would not want to share Russian secrets with your huge audience, but because I genuinely do not know.
Yeah,
These are decisions which are made by general staffs and by the commander-in-chief. But there's no doubt in my mind that we're at a very important crossing point. And I think that what Putin is saying, what Lavrov is saying, and you're absolutely right, they don't normally talk like that. This is a very different tone. I was in the Kremlin a couple of months ago, where Putin met with leaders of media organizations right after he spoke at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And when we were invited to that meeting, everybody thought that perhaps there would be an announcement of some tough move against the United States, against NATO. On the contrary, Putin talked about peace. Putin talked about negotiations. I was able to ask a question, and he made very clear that he was making these proposals because he really thought that it was his responsibility to give peace a chance. And what was the response? This invasion.
Yeah.
That was the response. It was a Russian peace initiative, which was once again contemptuously dismissed. And I think that we do hear really a lot of anger in statements from Moscow, but it's not just anger. It certainly is not bluffing. It is, I shouldn't say it is a warning.
Yeah, but
It is a clear message that we came to a point of no return.
yeah.
Let's stop.
Well, listen, I think you've been a voice for peace, a voice for reconciliation, your entire career. And you didn't leave the Soviet Union and become a hater of your homeland, but you became one who tried to, again, promote understanding. And I thank you for that. Yeah, I encourage you to continue to try to do that. Maybe, together we can try to do something to prevent this world from killing itself. But
Larry, thank you very much. And let me say that I obviously, not just me, but many of us in Moscow appreciate what you are doing. You're clearly doing it as a real American patriot, a person with a distinguished national security background. And I think that it's a reason for hope that there are people like you who are prepared to tell the truth to the American people about a very dangerous direction in which all of us are moving, and President Biden is hugely responsible for that.
Well, Dimitri, I thank you for your time. You've been most generous. I want to do this again because we have a lot more to discuss. But let me close out. This is Larry Johnson at Countercurrents. We've been fortunate to have Dimitri Simes with us today, a distinguished American, a distinguished Russian, and a man who is committed to peace. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Countercurrents. Thank you.
Larry, thank you so much. Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you, Dimitri.